Hello and welcome to Radical Democracy. We are very happy to have you join us today, and I'm very happy to have Phil McCrory with me. Today's show is on radical masculinity. So that is why Phil is here with us today. And actually, I was inspired to do this show by a friend of mine who has two young sons, and sadly, their father has left, and she's having a hard time finding role models for them that she feels are appropriate, strong people that these guys can look up to. So they're small. They're 7 and 3. So that's a problem that we hear about a lot. And so Phil actually does a lot of work with kids who are autistic, kids who have
Yeah,
different behavior problems. So I actually want to turn it over to Phil because I feel like men need to be heard from. There's a lot being said by us women about what men are, and I feel like in the same way that we expect men to listen to us and to allow us to make certain decisions about who we are and what we want as women, I think we need to afford men the same courtesy, that they should be able to tell us what it is to them to be a man. And a lot of times we as women, especially lately, we throw around this term toxic masculinity without balancing it out by talking about all those good guys that are out there, whether you want to call it divine masculinity or whatever you want to call it. I think that men certainly have a much better handle on what it means to deal with boys and young men than we as women do. So, over to you, Phil.
yeah. I mean, I don't think there's much to argue with there. Except that, I think, generally, I think, men have been heard from, but I think on this specific kind of in this new way of thinking, maybe post Me Too, especially where masculinity generally is being, kind of looked at with, a magnifying glass and there's a correction, and the correction is much needed, but at the same time, there's going to be, as some people put it, collateral damage, and some people are comfortable with that. I think reorganizing society in a way where girls and young women are given equal amount of chances, and I think that there's been a correction, and we've seen that bear fruit. Right now, you're seeing girls are outperforming boys at almost every academic level.
Really?
Oh
I didn't
yes.
know
Oh
that.
yeah. Yeah. And it's how many people are graduating from undergrad and now are being accepted to graduate school programs. Now I think, and I'm not 100% on this, but I'm pretty sure that even though less men are doing well, but they're still getting more graduate degrees in certain, STEM fields. But generally, especially in undergraduate level and in high school level and SAT scores, whatever you want to say across the gamut, girls are doing much better and outperforming boys. And if you go down the socioeconomic ladder, that contrast becomes even more stark,
Wow.
where girls are outperforming boys to a large degree, and that has a lot to do with, and I don't know how quickly if we want to get into that, we can talk about that in a little bit, but the school to prison pipeline,
Yep.
kind of the objectification of male bodies as physical threats and kind of nothing more than that.
Well, and I think that's a very important thing
Yeah.
to talk about, especially in the populations that you dealt with
Oh,
and deal
sure.
with, because that is something that until you said that to me, and of course I'm from like a completely different generation. I am a boomer, and I own that and love that. But I did, this isn't something that was in our awareness. And when you said to me this idea, I mean, of course I've heard the term toxic masculinity,
Yeah.
but what you are talking about right now, I think, is a really important thing to explain to people.
Yeah. Well, it actually comes out of probably, I think, one of the newer waves of feminism, which is to recognize that, hey, at any given time, there is this background threat of violence from men, and I think that's true in a real level, especially in the real world, not just in theory, but in practice, out on the street and late at night, and in bars and frat houses or wherever else. These type of your guard needs to be up because there are predators out there.
Right.
There's no doubt about that. That being said, the idea that toxic masculinity can be kind of shorthand for masculinity, period. that's when that starts getting really kind of fuzzy. And even though these dangers are real and the threat of violence is always there, I think it is, we have to recognize that, but at the same time, it's just like we are more than that. It's like saying,
Yes.
like, we're not going to put hijab on everybody who I feel like that they might be a sexual being. So in the United States, we're not saying that, like, in order to prevent young men from feeling sexual urges, we need to cover women up and say that, this is bad. The
Right,
converse would
right.
be like that. It'd be just like, listen, we need young men not to have muscles
Right.
or be bigger than us because this is the way we feel. And so what we do that, and we suspend kids from school. We remove, kids who tend to be more violent, and a lot of the times there are intergenerational reasons for that. I think you talked briefly off air about kind of if it's legal to hit your kids in your home, and in a lot of cultures, like, it is commonplace, and
Yes.
especially among young boys, it's encouraged between between brothers or cousins or with their dad and their uncle, really rolling around and like being like, because this is something that you're going to need. This is a skill that we're going to teach you because you might need to be physical one day.
Right.
Then they go to school and they use physicality the same way they've been being taught and been being reinforced for, and they're being suspended as kindergartners, as first graders.
Right.
And once that happens, and that label gets put on them, and their behavior intervention plan gets put in place, and the teachers read that before they get, and the mind's made up about the kid, and they have this very deep emotional connection to the idea that they're transgressing all the time because they are this out of control animal, if that's what they kind of feel like
Right.
a beast, like a monster. And kids will say this. They'll articulate that. And kids with that are limited verbally will still articulate, like, I feel like people treat me like a monster. And this is coming from 5 and 6 year olds, which is and it's really difficult, especially as educators and mental health practitioners, which is where kind of this angle comes in. Although I think young men are especially vulnerable in this particular window.
Yes.
I think it's part of a much larger mental health crisis generally, where the things that we understand about psychology, period, should be leading to like people out in the streets saying that like what we are doing in this society is harmful to people.
Yeah.
Setting them up with the type of incentives we have, and we are basically just creating generational trauma, and
Exactly.
poverty being the kind of root cause of that, and just saying like, well, this is just the way it is, and we can't get involved in people's homes, and we can't. And I'm not an authoritarian. I don't want the government knocking on people's doors and telling them how to parent their kids, but we can set up incentives in society that say this is important.
Yeah. And I think we can, to a degree, tell people how to parent their kids to the extent that we can educate people, and we really should all be on board with, I say this many times, the idea of removing school funding from property taxes. We will remain a classed society
Yeah,
for
absolutely.
as long as we do that. And really, any change we're going to make in our culture is going to come from how we are treating and educating our children.
Absolutely. And thinking about how you measure that, and that's really the problem right now, is that we're trying to quantify all the time academic progress, right? And like you can't do that on a normative basis. You can't take an entire population of a Suffolk County or a New York State or United States of America and say that this is the way we're going to do it. When we know as educators, when you get in there, and psychologists, mental health professionals, what have you, every individual needs an individual plan,
Right.
because there are any million, billion, infinite confounds on what could be the cause of, or the root of whatever behavior or pathology or whatever you want to call it. We can't parse out intergenerational learning from biology, from societal influences, from what somebody said to their friend, what they had for breakfast that morning. All of these things lead to whatever the particular behavior or decision that kid's making in that very moment is individual and unique to that child in that moment. And having these, you think there's an algorithm for it, there's not.
No. And that's the problem, is that we think there's an algorithm for everything, for one thing. And even Bill Gates admitted recently that his big test on core curriculum and testing.
He destroyed
programs, stuff
education in
was-
this country.
was
He single-handedly,
really
talk about
destroyed, the core curriculum. And he recently admitted maybe he was wrong.
Yeah, maybe. Oh,
Yeah,
too bad.
oh, right.
Yeah, sorry I destroyed your entire educational system. Good luck with that. I'm going to move on to something else now.
Yes.
Yeah,
And not
no.
only destroyed our educational system, but has destroyed individual children.
Oh, lives,
Has
certainly.
destroyed. You have story after story. I have been in schools with kindergartners where I'm hearing kindergartners screaming and crying because they do not want to go to school. I have heard stories from parents about how my son was so excited to go to school first day of kindergarten, rode on the bus, came home, never wanted to go back again.
Sure.
To the point where now in New York State, you probably know this, we have to pay if a child we can't get a child into school, we have to pay to have somebody come and homeschool that child.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, there's a feedback loop, and it's getting worse.
Right.
And I think, most people in this country, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum or, race, creed, religion, or what, want to get rid of standardized testing.
Yes.
It's like junk mail. Like, none of us want it, right? But somehow it just keeps coming in the mail.
Because of, in our case, in our state, our less than illustrious governor, but because people are making lots of money
Yes,
over
so there's
it.
somebody profiting from it, and that's
Yes.
why we keep, even with the fossil fuels, the fact that people attach themselves like it's part of their personality now that I burn gasoline and I really enjoy it. And I'm like, what? What on earth? Like, where? I just like that. That is the most bonkers. Like, you
Right.
let ExxonMobil decide this for you because they have a reason. It's not a conspiracy.
Right.
It's an incentive. And the incentives are there for
Yep.
ExxonMobil for you not to care about that. And at the same time, they've been, contingency planning for climate change and the eventual awakening of society to this for a very long time.
Exactly.
And, yeah.
Exactly. I was listening this morning to a lecture on Rome, and
Hmm.
actually Rome during the time of Jesus, and specifically talking about
Sure.
the rebellion, like not talking about it from the religious standpoint,
Right.
but from the rebellion standpoint.
Sure.
And when it was describing the way Rome ruled and why everybody was rebelling, I'm like, that's us. We're still Rome. We are still coming
Oh,
from
yeah.
this concept that our governor or our president or our congressperson somehow is better than we are, and therefore gets to make these decisions that we don't really want, but benefit them, and then it's kind of okay with us if they punish us when we rebel.
Yeah. Well, it's a part of, it's about in-groups and out-groups. And people will shape their thinking, whatever it is, to remain part of whatever in-group they see preferable.
Mm-hmm.
So, whatever incentives are actually lined up for the person to belong to that in-group, that's the behavior pattern they're going to follow. And that's why people can just saying I'm in for small government my entire life. And then Trump comes along and they say I'm for, bigger government. I
Right.
want, yeah, and I'm like, I want to get in the middle of your, and you're like, okay, well, sure, but and you can kind of people are guilty of this on both sides of the political spectrum. I don't need to pick on Trump, well, maybe a little bit, but but generally, we will do this. We will have knee-jerk reactions,
Right.
to just this is the way I'm supposed to think. I mean,
Right.
right now, I don't know if to dodge politics or not right here, but there's a big an endorsement for Bernie Sanders from a guy who's kind of like a masculine man. I guess this fits into the topic, right?
Right.
So I don't know if you're familiar with Joe Rogan.
Yeah.
Yes, of course. So he has pretty much the biggest podcast, and it's independent, and he answers to absolutely no one. And so he speaks pretty freely, and he's a comedian, and he pushes people's buttons, and he pushes, he doesn't speak, he's certainly not politically correct, and laughs
No.
in the face of political correctness, which, that's another topic, but, generally he's he thinks of himself as a progressive or a liberal, right? He has some gun ideas and hunting and stuff, very
Yeah.
on the manly, kind of like the,
Right.
he's a bro.
He's sort of back and forth. Right?
Yeah, he's a bro, and he has some pretty regressive, or we'll say pretty regressive things in opinions about gender roles and things like that, right? No one is holding him up as a scion of progressive thinking,
Right.
in 2020.
Right.
But he just said he's thinking about it was a really loose endorsement of Bernie Sanders.
Right. Considering it.
Yeah, and what comes out of that is and especially considering the kind of the last 2 weeks that we've had, with this split in the Democratic Party between, as I see it, like identity politics, which is saying
Right.
that like, hey, you look at it's us against them. In this case, it was Elizabeth Warren kind of playing towards women, just saying like it's us, it's women
Right.
versus them, men.
Exactly.
And, we've seen it actually right now. It's been a losing proposition for her. It probably likely killed her campaign. We'll see in the
Yes.
next couple of weeks. But right now, indications are that, like, that was devastating for her. Because people in this moment in the 21st century, I think maybe it's generational somewhat, but I think it's just everybody is kind of waking up to this new media idea where authenticity rules.
Yes.
Messaging doesn't matter anymore. You can message your brains out, right? And like, who was that dirty little weasel who worked for Reagan, who kind of changed politics? I forget his name, but he died of brain cancer. Lee Atwater. Lee Atwater like was a ferocious campaign, Republican operative, right? Basically, he was just. His greatest hits, you'd be like, oh, of course, this, oh
Right.
yeah, that, yeah, well, welfare queen, like whatever. Like he was really like some of the strongest Republican messaging and the right wing messaging at that time. He was responsible for. He wouldn't some of that stuff like just doesn't fly anymore. It doesn't hold the same water. People can read the BS, and I think that's why actually Trump has had success too. Is because even though he's a fraud, but he's an authentic fraud.
Right.
Like he's a fraud all the time.
Right.
Like that's him. Like he's like that when the
Well, and
cameras go off. Like
yeah.
he's a fraud.
And I also think the appeal of him is he's from outside. He is
Absolutely.
and was an actual outsider.
Yeah.
And I think that we are fed up with this with this idea that you have to be a Democrat, you have to be a Republican, you
absurd.
have to vote for one. Don't think for yourself. Just vote red or blue.
Yes.
Don't be purple.
Yeah.
Don't do that
Yeah.
because then we're in trouble. And that one of the things that I personally detest, and we talk a lot about in the Women's Oneness Project, is this idea of voting for somebody just because they are a woman. Because if we're really going to elevate who our leaders are, we have to really start looking at character.
Yeah.
And saying, oh, well, this person is of good character.
Right.
Like Bernie Sanders, like his politics or not, this is a man who has voted. He has what he has said he would do. He has done since he's been in Congress.
Yeah, he shows up and like on this to call Bernie Sanders a misogynist in the face of what the rampant misogyny that's in place in power right now is to undermine that message.
Yes.
Because he's not. It's to turn everybody who doesn't completely agree with your particular view
Right.
into a misogynist is dangerous.
Very
You'll find
dangerous.
yourself in a room, with not many people in it.
Right.
And I think that's what we're happening. And I think there's, we're learning the internet right now as a society. We're figuring out how to do social media. And, I think we're figuring out how to really we should be ignoring it.
Yeah.
Like that's the reality.
pretty much
Is that it gives power to kind of the most hysterical among us.
Right.
And really those people feel really validated and they find communities and it coalesces into
Exactly.
like these movements that we think are real. And when you go out in the street, you can't find a person who would say any of this stuff, right?
Right.
But it seems like there's an army. And some of it actually is just bots and like, actually people being paid out there to get people riled up to yell at each other,
Right.
which is happening. And we all need to be, keenly aware of that at all times. Like anytime you're arguing with somebody on the internet, there's a really good chance it's not a person.
Really?
I mean,
I quit that a long time
Like-
ago because it was a person and I didn't want
well,
to go there with
listen,
that person.
there are
But
people
really,
you're arguing,
yeah.
yes, yeah. But there'll be person, but there'll be people who are operatives to really just sow discord. Not that they don't have any real ideological bent. They're just there to say the things that will inflame you the most. And there's formulas for this. It's like if I know that you are a progressive Democrat, you're an Elizabeth Warren supporter, right? I will go to you and I'll be like, I know you're a Trump supporter. And people cannot resist from saying, no, I'm not. I'm this. And they'll be like, well, you are, though, because this. And I'm like, no, I'm not. And this can go on. And they're getting paid by the reply. And so, like,
Wow.
yeah. So that's Active Measures. It's a great documentary. You look into it. It's about essentially it's the way that Russians carry out psyops, which they've been doing for years. It's just been documented. It's like common knowledge, and you can see the fruits of it all over the place. And right now, it doesn't matter whose side you're on. They're using our anger against us.
Against us, exactly.
To weaken us. And it's not, this is pretty much like, Spycraft 101. This is what Russia's been up to. They've been trying to do it for the last 70 or 80 years. They're just way more successful at it because media has been democratized in a good way, but also it's like the printing press where it's now the reins are off. They can't control the information anymore. And people don't have the training to parse from the sensational and the stuff that gets you to react, the conspiracy theory, the stuff that makes you feel powerful, that lets you know that, like, yes, it's a really easy answer. There's an evil guy, and he's doing this thing, and that's the only thing you need to worry about. It's not our whole system and the way that, everyone you buy your Fruit Loops at the store that you're contributing to this. No, it's not that. There's just an evil guy who's pushing a button somewhere. And it's like, oh, well, now I understand it, and I feel powerful because, I get this. And, that's what I think it's a matter of control. It's like, now this is easy for me to understand. There's a good guy and a bad guy, and it's black and white, and here I am. We're getting a little. I've taken down a rabbit hole.
Well, but I'm gonna bring us around because you hit a very important point that we continuing to remain angry at each other and is not serving us.
No.
And when you look at the progression of any trauma. Psychologically, the only way you're going to get over it is to get through the anger part of it.
Yeah.
So when you're dealing with boys who are marginalized, as you say, and young men, what is it that you're seeing, and what approaches do you find work
Well, it actually feeds into
best?
Exactly what we're talking about. So it's about alienation, right? And so at the core of this, I think Johann Hari is a really good book. I forget the title right now, but the major hypothesis, the premise, whatever, is that, like, the opposite of addiction is not addiction. The opposite of addiction is connection. And so we are all, and addiction generally is like, addiction's not a special type of pathology. It's not like a thing aside from anything else. It's actually, addiction is more a symptom of the overall dysfunction. Right, which is that, like, we are not connecting with each other in ways that are actually necessary for our biological well-being.
Yeah.
Like, being around other people and being in a way where you are feeling productive and not put upon and not, ostracized, because that's actually the most dangerous thing you can do, is be ostracized by a group, is to belong to a group and to have responsibility and fulfill that responsibility in that group. Is what's missing from a lot of people's lives.
Right.
And young men, especially in our society and the way that we set up rewards, you're saying, like, it's not to be, I guess, I think any 25-year-old is going to feel a lot of anxiety about not being successful, or especially in this climate right now. There's not a lot of 25-year-olds out there who have bought their first house and, have paid off all their loans. Like, that's just, that doesn't exist anymore. But there is a special type of thing where, especially when you talk about status and men kind of needing status in our society in order to attract significant others, and other men or women, doesn't matter who it is, right?
Right.
Monetary success is a big part of that, and being successful in some way, right? And it's actually, and I know if there's any, being a Long Islander and having to spend my early 20s here, it's tough living with your parents. Living in, splitting money to live in some basement apartment in some, in some split.
Right.
And, like, it's, you're not, it's difficult to impress people. So there's an extra component of, like, men need to be, providers. Men, and there is still a societal pressure. As much as we say we're moving past this right now, like, you can see that, like, in couples where, wife makes more than a husband, there's even if they're okay with it, there's still a stress that happens because the societal expectations, like, they weigh on men. Men, stay-at-home men, it's like you feel judged. I'm a person that's had a variable schedule. Even that, like, I'm working, right? But I'm not at work on Wednesday at 10 a.m.
Right.
And so I'm around, senior citizens and moms who are shot, and, like, I feel like they're like, oh, he must be at work. And, like, there's, like, this little, I don't even know if that's what they're thinking, but that's what's going around in my head, is because I know I'm looking around, there's nobody like me. This is and this is as a divorced dad who's had to go to, school functions and go to these things and, like, or be a man, be at a park with your kid and not feel weird, like, people, like, making sure that you want to actually be with your kid and show them, like, look, I'm here with a kid because
it's my kid.
My kid, I'm not just here, everybody, like, but those type of things, like, really, do weigh on you. So I think young men they feel like they need status, and it's very difficult to come by any type of status as a young person in our society right now. It's just this is why social media
Yeah.
is such a thing. They're looking for status.
And the messages are so mixed. I
Yeah.
mean, that's what I think is really difficult, even for young women, young women and young men, is on some college campuses, if you're a guy, you can't even flirt. And
Yeah.
yet you get on social media or television, and here's all these seductive women. Women are being told to dress seductively. And then there's these men that are all pumped up and looking like that's who you're supposed to be. And it's like, at the same time, we're telling you,
Well,
but don't flirt.
oh,
But
yeah.
but don't do this and don't do that.
In our society, we look at who are the men who are attracting the most attractive women, the high status women. They're men who engage in these hypermasculine professions. Even
Right.
but it's funny. I've heard actors think like acting is a hypermasculine profession. It's not.
Right.
It's actually like it's dress up and you're pretending all the time, right? And I've had actually, I think it was Ed Norton who was talking about like there's this overcompensation that happens with like your Sylvester Stallones or your Josh Brolin's or whatever, like it's just like so you project extra masculinity because you're aware that you're kind of just playing dress up all the time. But those type of pictures that we have, the Arnold Schwarzeneggers and like all the football stars and the baseball, basketball stars and the fighters. Don't forget, like we are a violent society.
Oh, yeah.
And there's a whole day of the week dedicated to ritual violence, and it's called the
Football.
NFL. Yeah.
Right.
And it's a huge business, and I'm not going to get into that whole thing with boys, but boys are encouraged to be violent. They're encouraged to be savages. And then they bump in against the other societal rules,
Right.
which is this hypocrisy of it, right? Which is like, really, we want to have like, hey, let's just not have violence, but we want to keep our violence. People really like their violence. It's not going anywhere. And so we have to find ways. This is what sports came from generally. It's like, okay, we're going to stop going to war so often. Like, we realize that we kind of need to fight this red versus blue or, whatever it is game. So let's create these games with rules that are like war. Let's simulate it so we actually don't kill each other. We go home at the end of it.
Right.
We're losing sight of that a little bit because now people are like in the parking lot of NFL games, like killing each other, and just our politics have now become more like rooting for football teams, where it's like it doesn't matter who you sign. If the guy beat his wife, you're going to root for him in the same way that if you have a president who says he's going to grab him here and do all these things, and you're like, yeah, I don't like it, but he's my guy. He's my team. I'm rooting for my team. I know what happens if my team loses. I feel bad. And I feel like I've lost something. But young men are facing these double standards. We're saying we are asking you to be violent. We're also, not really recognizing people's sexuality in a real way, where you are,
Absolutely.
we're talking about, and I think that there's a legalization for sex work argument that needs to happen here. Real honestly, I don't know how well that's going to do for, my 19-year-old clients who want their parents to come to me. But the reality is I think that this is part of what I thought. They are even kids with special needs who are 19, they are sexual beings.
Right.
They have the same plumbing that the rest of us have, and the same biological imperatives to do something with it.
Right.
And to just pretend like this isn't real and it's not happening. And kids, these marginalized kids, these kids with social learning problems, we'll say, who are isolated anyway, don't have many friends, are spending time on the internet learning about the world through the internet, which is one of the worst lenses to view the world.
Yeah.
And that's creating a feedback loop. And so it's, it is a particularly dangerous time for young men, but especially young men with special needs, young men on the spectrum. It's easy to get sucked into things. It's easy to, talk about people getting scammed, romantic scams.
Oh, yeah.
In the ASD community is huge because,
Really?
well, you think about generally, it's like you can't pick up on the cues.
Oh.
The little language cues and the things that would make sense to me, where I'd be like, oh, obviously, this person's not real, understanding that. I mean, generally, if there's, this is social media advice for all men, period. If there's a woman who seems to be out of your league who wants to meet you that evening, she's not a real woman on the other end of that thing. Like it's just there's a general. I think this is like in spycraft. They would tell you if somebody who's you feel like who's out of your league is broke, you need to stop talking to that person immediately. And it sounds a little messed up and what it is, but like we would know somebody who was although let's men get their signals crossed anyway. So right in that way they can be like manipulated kind of very easily like that,
Yes.
right?
Yes, there is such a thing as
yeah.
toxic femininity too.
Well, yeah. I mean, you can see. Yeah.
It's not like it's one or the other out there.
Well, I can say that women can use their sexuality to an end.
Yeah.
Right. And the same way as male sexuality can be dangerous. There's the sexuality for women can be used to an end where maybe it's not such a great result all the time.
Right.
But that being said, to deny this from these young men and to say that we're not going to talk about sex with kids who have ASD. We're not going to talk about, it's like we're going to let them call a girl 15 times in a row. And she's going to let him call him because of that bigotry of low expectations, which you were kind of talking about before, right? Which is to say that, like, we don't expect him to be able to pick up on these cues. We're not even going to hold him to that account. But what's happening with him is he's not learning that for the next girl, when he's a little more serious about this one, and he's sure that he's in love with this girl, and she tells him to stop texting, and he doesn't. And he goes to the next level, and it's like, and this happens with literal thinkers generally. It's like, stop texting. Okay, I'll go just stand outside of your apartment, and I'll wait for you there. Or I'll go to your work, and I'll there, and I'll start talking to you. And I think that, like, this type of, like, social learning, where every single one of these scenarios kind of has to be spelled out, especially for kids with ASD, but for just young men generally, we have no idea how to talk to women, how to join a group of men that's going to make them feel good and feel a part of, like, and some of the lessons are pretty easy. And I wish I had somebody to come to them. It's just like look them in the eye, listen to what they're saying, right? Don't interrupt them.
Right.
Be interested in what they're interested in. Make yourself interested in what they're interested in.
Right.
Be a nice person. Be a little too cool. Like, act like you don't need them. And that's true of even friendships and stuff like this.
Sure.
Like, you shouldn't. We all need our friends, right? But it gets a little weird when you really need your friends all the time. Then it becomes a different type of relationship. It becomes a one-way relationship.
And I think that friendship is harder for men. I mean, I think
we're
adult
friends. We don't make friends as adults.
Women are. It's like I always joke with the kids about when we're talking about women being the gatherers and men being the hunters, and we talk about how women are better at multitasking and men are better at focusing. But also, I mean, I guarantee you that if my sisters and I were sitting around waiting for a deer, we'd be talking. There'd be no more deer. They would be gone. We would be socializing,
we see these patterns, right?
Hanging out, right? So
Yeah.
it's good to be the berry picker because berries don't run away; they're stuck on a bush.
Absolutely.
So, and men, when we were hunting, that tendency towards assertiveness in its best form, or aggressiveness, or protecting the family and providing for the family.
Sure.
That was all.
That is a real biological, like, imperative from, like, there is a part of everybody, right? But I think especially of men that says that, like, you need to be able to take care of the people around you. And if you are, in fact, and this is why suicide's much higher amongst men, and especially amongst men who lose their jobs, amongst men who lose their family, and, like, those two things usually kind of come in conjunction, right? Because it's unfortunate. This is another part of, like, the hypocrisy of society, which is telling men they need to open up and be more emotionally available, right? But the problem with that is, everybody, right, is that most male emotion expresses itself as aggression. And so at the same time, we're saying you need to be more open with your feelings. No, stop. Don't you dare raise your voice. Don't interrupt me. Don't you dare. And, like,
I know it's
a chick. You have to. Do you want male emotionality? Because it's not pretty, and especially because of thousands of years of tradition, where, like, men are taught that anger is acceptable. Anger is the only acceptable expression of emotion.
Right.
We want stoicism and anger.
Right.
And that's it. And anybody doing anything like that is going to make It's going to make men uncomfortable. It's going to make women not so attractive to you. We can say that it'll be the opposite. And there are women, of course, who want sensitive men, want men who are in touch with their feelings. Like, I'm lucky enough to have one, right? Well, I don't have one. I don't have anybody. But like,
See how hard it is?
There's somebody who I have in my life.
Right.
Right. I don't own them by any measure. Certainly not. I lost my train of thinking now to make sure that I'm like, that's hard. But yeah.
Well, when we're talking about that we want sensitive men,
Right.
at the same time, I've a great example from a friend of ours who he's a martial artist and a wonderful guy, and he has a son who he
Yep.
trained in martial arts. And, that martial arts is a wonderful thing for boys to train in with the right teacher. I mean, my husband's
I
a
think it's
martial
excellent.
artist,
Yeah.
and we've had talks before on this show about the concept of the peaceful warrior. So he's, this. He's trained, and then in school they have all these anti-bullying programs going on, and you have to stand up for people.
Yeah.
And he sees on the playground this big guy picking on this little guy. He's got the little guy by the shirt,
Sure.
and my friend's son, who is little, he's not a big, tall guy,
Right.
goes up to him and says, "Hey, let him go.
Sure.
Let go of him."
Yeah.
And the kid says something like, "Make me."
Yeah.
And he said, "I'm going to tell you one more time.
All right.
Please let him go."
Sure.
And he didn't, and he hit him. He did
Yeah.
not anything devastating, but he did do some
Well,
martial arts.
here's the thing
move.
about like when children are fighting, almost none of it is devastating.
Yeah.
So because they're children and they can't actually generate enough power to really, because it's like, it's akin to watching kittens play.
Right.
Like, they're going to hurt each other to an extent. And actually, none of these children, save a few really rare examples, actually want to hurt the other kid. They do want to assert dominance, right?
Right.
They do want to engage in this back and forth. But a lot of the time, it's like, even the bullies, man, and this is why you punch a bully, right? Is because the bully goes like, oh, man, I don't want to get punched again. I don't even care if I lose. And I was a kid who fought a lot as a young kid, and I was a smaller kid. And, my grandfather's a Gold Glove boxer, and we really, are an Irish family, and we're pugilists at heart. And and there's a thing where it's like we have Irish pride's a real thing. And you do not disrespect me, or especially my family. Because if you do, it is totally within my right to try to knock your teeth out.
Right.
Or try to break your nose or take you down. And it's like, and this in my family, they'd be like, yeah, if my family,
This is
good,
where you're raised,
good, yeah,
right.
yeah. You, what did he say to you? Yeah, good. That's what he deserved. But you do that, and they don't bother you anymore, right? But at the same time, you were also that kid who flipped his lid,
Right.
Who punched somebody
and
in
that's
the
what
face.
happened to my friend's son. Sadly,
become
both
isolated.
the kids got in trouble.
Well, that's
The
a zero
bully
tolerance.
and the kid.
That's a zero tolerance BS that the school is trying to push now. It's like, but that totally just betrays the, kind of, if we understand that kids are coming from different homes and different types of circumstances, and the most marginalized kids in the toughest homes are going to be your most violent, and we're putting them in a box where they have no choice, like not really no choice, but they have very little room for error.
Right.
To do this transgress. And also, they're just doing what they have been conditioned to do, which is to use violence, especially in a neighborhood where you grow up, like, to protect yourself.
Right.
And then there's a social currency to violence, too, where somebody's saying something to me and I punch them, right? Then people know. It's like, oh, no, I wouldn't say anything to him. Like, he fights back. And people know that, and they'll respect you for that. And that currency is worth a lot more than whatever, Mrs. Hendrickson has to say to what in class. Like, it's just like that's not going to be as powerful as the type of clout that I get when I go back home and my older brother and my cousin said, hey, I heard what's his face said something to you, and you gave him a black eye, man. Good job.
Yeah.
There's no one's, if I get an A on a test, my cousin's not going to be like, hey, man, I heard you got that A on your test. Good job. But he's going to hear about that fight, and like, that's what I'm being reinforced to do. And I'm going to go back and I want to learn that, like, being suspended is like actually pretty good for me. Getting in trouble all the time is actually pretty good for me. At least I have power. I got status. I'm somebody. I don't back down from people. And it's real easy to cut. And that's you want to call it toxic masculinity?
Yeah.
Fine. I mean, but I think that there's bigger societal things at play.
Exactly.
That, like, we are not taking care of people generally.
No, and we're not from the time they're here. One of the callers, my husband,
Okay.
asked, so when you're working with the boys,
Yeah.
what solutions do you see to this problem, or what when you're in your groups?
I mean, it depends like which group we're talking about, right? So,
Okay.
so if I'm running these groups, generally it's about it has to be social education, right? I think media literacy is a big part of it. At the end of it, right? At a younger ages, what we actually want kids to do is, and this is actually you're talking about martial arts, right? Is start to exhibit inhibition. I mean, curbing inhibition at any curbing your impulses at any turn, right? And that means like sitting still. Ask boys who are rambunctious to sit still, but it's a skill, and
Yeah.
it's a skill you have to learn, and it's more difficult for kinetic young men and boys who are not
Right.
they're not learning at a desk very well.
Well, and also the way school is set up, they're expecting children to sit still far too much.
Yes, well, that's
Far too long.
Well, I mean, the school is basically set up to ask like certain types of kids, and I think boys fit into this profile a little more often, where they're just saying like, no, from the onset, like you don't belong here.
Yeah.
We're putting you're a round peg. We're putting you in a square hole, and like that's the end of it. Get used to it or get lost.
Mm-hmm.
And and it's really, we were talking about it earlier, the incentives it's so that they can get these numbers, pass them on to the state
Right.
or to the feds, and say, look, give us the funding we need, because if not, I know you're going to punish us, which is absurd, and I'm glad we kind of moved away from that with punishing schools that need it
Yeah.
the most, but like we did that for a decade or more.
Oh yeah.
And it's no better now. It's not that much better now. But we're still saying that, like, you guys are failing these. Look at like every year, like you're not hitting your marks.
Right.
How could we put more money into the school when we're giving you all this money and you're still not hitting these marks? Well, if we just stop paying the Pearson Mafia or whatever you want
Yes.
to call like
Thank
the
you. Yes, the Pearson Mafia.
yeah, the Pearson
Our
Mafia,
governor's best bud.
or just our corrupt governor, who is he is corrupt as
And
the day
his-
is long.
And his way of dealing with parents who are protesting the whole opt-out movement
Yeah.
is to threaten.
Well,
to
I
threaten
think
punishing.
he does that with all of his anybody who criticizes
Thinks
him
he's an
whatsoever.
emperor.
Yes, well, look what he's done to progressive Democrats generally in this, and like in mocks, I tell this to certain political, keep mocking socialism, keep doing it, because like you're proving our point.
Yeah.
Is that like, you're laughing at things where we're just saying we would like a world where people who take care of other people get paid a living wage. And not only that, but that would raise all boats. So, like special rural communities, upstate communities, you're saying that, like, for all the elderly people and young, infants, like school-age kids that we need care for,
Right.
that the state's gonna pay them and pay them a living wage to take care of. This is why socialized medicine is so important. Medicare for all is so important, is because you can open up these communities. People can still live there. They can get living wages, and they can take care of each other. And instead of sending that money to Walmart, instead of sending that money to the Pearson Mafia, right, we are actually keeping it in these communities.
Right,
And-
right.
and,
That is what it, by the way, people, if you have not listened, and if you haven't listened to the TED Talk by the guy that owns, I shouldn't say what he owns because it's called the Anti-CEO Playbook. So
Okay.
look it up on TED Talk, listen
I'll
to
check
it
it
because
out.
it'll shock you
For sure.
when he tells you what company he formed doing this
Uh-huh.
sharing, creating a company that actually serves the community and serves the people who
Right.
work there. So we've got 2 minutes left,
Oh,
my
okay.
dear.
Wow,
so
that's quick.
So just, anything you want to say, you'll come back on. We'll have you
Okay,
back.
yeah.
So how would you like to wrap it up here?
I'd like to wrap it up to say everybody needs to make sure that they are registered to vote, and that you know where your polling place is. And because New York State has a pretty early, they pushed it back, which is a shocker, having anything pro-democratic coming from Cuomo. But they recognized, I think, they pushed it back the last day, but I think it's like within a week or two right now. I think it's pretty close.
Right.
I think it might be as late as April, but I think it might be pretty close. So check your registration, make sure you're registered to vote for the primaries, and vote with your conscience.
Vote your conscience. And I would just still like to add that we really need to start talking more and more about seriously changing the education system. I am waiting. There's one person running for president, Marianne Williamson, the only one running for president that has said that we should stop funding education through property taxes. And I really think that we need to start
she's right
a
about that.
movement in this country. I don't think she's electable for a lot of reasons, but when you hear somebody saying something that's important to you, don't write them off.
No.
And don't think that if you're voting for some obscure person or you're voting for a third party or that your vote doesn't count. Your vote always counts. I've said this before on the show. If you want to write a letter, either state or federal letter, you better have voted. They don't know who you voted for, but they do know whether or not you voted. And if you haven't voted, whatever you write just goes in the trash. They're not even going to listen to you. So if you want to follow up on a particular cause like education, make sure you're voting.
Yeah,
It's
especially
very important.
locally. We all need
Yep,
to.
locally.
I'm guilty of it as well. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, so thank you, Phil.
Thank
You're
you.
coming back. We'll have you back
All right.
on in the very near future with some other folks to talk about where we need to go in education.
Hey.
Thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you, my wonderful producer, Bobby Lacerra, and everybody here at Strong Island Radio. And as always, to all of you out there, peace, love, and unity. See you soon.